Okay, so chapter 9 is about cellular respiration, which is basically just a continuation of chapter 8, because in chapter 8 we were talking about metabolism and how all the reactions work, how enzymes work. And so now that we understand enzymes, we can look at some particular enzymes and what they do in our body. Cellular respiration is very important. One thing to remember is that cellular respiration is done by all living things. So it's not plants do photosynthesis, animals do cellular respiration. Everyone does cellular respiration because everyone needs to get ATP. Even plants who make their own glucose then in turn take that glucose, break it down to get the ATP out of it. So the reason for this is because all living cells require energy. And remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed, the first law of thermodynamics. So we got to get it from somewhere. And so, we could be plants, we would get it from the sunlight. We could be chimpanzees, and we would get it from eating plants. Or we could be carnivores, which we would get it by eating something that eats plants. So we can get it from anywhere, but it'll eventually all trace back to the sun, and we all need it. That's basically the point of this. So I just said energy enters an ecosystem as sunlight and leaves as heat. So remember, the second law of thermodynamics, energy transfer is not 100% efficient. We're always going to lose some energy no matter what in the form of heat, always. So that heat can't really be used. It's the least useful kind of energy. So no matter what, we're losing heat to the universe. And that extra heat is causing extra entropy. So with every energy transfer, we have an increased entropy. So photosynthesis makes oxygen and organic molecules. In this case, we're going to talk mostly about glucose, which then are used in cellular respiration. And we use the chemical energy that's stored in those organic compounds in glucose to make ATP, which allows us to have all of the energy that we need. So basically, you guys are going to be very familiar with this picture throughout the next two chapters. It's on page 163 with titles. This one doesn't have it. Is it? No. Oh, they're there. Light energy enters an ecosystem. Chloroplasts perform photosynthesis to make organic molecules and oxygen. Then our mitochondria use oxygen and organic molecules to make ATP, which powers cellular work. Some energy is always lost as heat, so that's the ultimate fate of all energy. And then the carbon dioxide and water go back to the chloroplasts to make more organic molecules. So chapter 9.1 talks about how we make energy from these catabolic pathways. Remember, catabolic means breaking down. And so we do what's called oxidize organic fuels. So we're going to need to talk about what oxidation means, because we're going to talk so much about oxidation and reduction in this chapter. So several processes are central to cellular respiration and related pathways, and one of them is oxidation. So the breakdown of organic molecules is exergonic, which you guys should know, right? We're breaking things down, so it's releasing energy. It's increasing entropy because we're making more small things, which is less ordered, and we're releasing heat into the universe, which is increasing entropy as well. So fermentation is a partial degradation of sugars that occur without oxygen. So that's the last section, but fermentation happens in the absence of oxygen. And what happens is we only break down the sugar a little bit of the way because we can't go the rest of the way because we don't have oxygen. So we can only do it just a little bit. And aerobic respiration is a kind of respiration that takes in organic molecules and oxygen and makes ATP. So that's what our cells mostly do, aerobic respiration. Aerobic meaning with oxygen. And anaerobic is anaerobic respiration, so respiration that happens without oxygen is similar to aerobic respiration, but we will use a different molecule than oxygen. So cellular respiration, the whole process can be anaerobic and aerobic. We're going to learn about both pathways, but normally it refers to aerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration is things like fermentation as well as other things, but mostly cellular respiration refers to aerobic respiration. And this is the equation for cellular respiration. It's C6H12O6, which is glucose, plus 6 O2 molecules becomes 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O plus energy. So that energy will be ATP and heat. Because remember, some heat is always lost as a consequence of energy transfer. So memorize that equation. You will need to know it in your sleep. So we have these things called redox reactions. Redox reactions are a reaction that happens at the same time. It's one reaction. And something gets reduced and something gets oxidized. And you guys don't know what that means, but we can't have one without the other. Reduction has to happen with oxidation. And basically, it's the transfer of electrons. So we're going to transfer electrons from one product or from one reactant to another to get two new products, and that will yield us oxidation and reduction. And it will help us release energy. So that's the process by which we do it. We transfer electrons. And so, like I said, they're called redox reactions. And so, I'm going to start with reduction. In reduction, something is gaining electrons. Remember that electrons are negative, and so you're becoming more negative. You're being reduced. So you are reduced if you are gaining electrons. If you are giving up electrons, you are becoming oxidized. Okay, so oxidation is a loss of electrons. Reduction is a gaining of electrons. And so these always happen together, so they're called redox. Oxidation reduction reactions. Okay, so let's look at this. This is sodium and chlorine coming together to become sodium chloride. Remember that sodium chloride is formed by an ionic bond. So one just has a positive charge and one has the other as an electron is transferred. So we have sodium, which is neutral, chlorine, which is neutral. But after the reaction, chlorine, or sodium, becomes positive, Na plus Cl. You guys probably knew that. Sodium is positive because it gave up an electron, so now it's positive. Chlorine, on the other hand, gained an electron to fill its octet shell, and so now it's negative. So chlorine got reduced, sodium got oxidized. So it's an oxidation reduction reaction, redox reaction. And so the general rule is some reactant with an electron becomes oxidized, gives up that electron at the end, it doesn't have that electron anymore, and the other reactant gains that electron and becomes reduced. So we can see the transfer of the single electron. So this is like the general equation for it. And then it's confusing. So if you get oxidized, you lose an electron, but you become, whatever donates the electron is the electron donor or the reducing agent, and whatever gains the electron is the oxidizing agent. So if you're going to get oxidized, you're going to give up an electron, you are allowing the reduction to happen by giving up your electrons, so you are the reducing agent. So you're getting oxidized, you are the reducing agent. You're getting reduced, you are the oxidizing agent. It's confusing, but just think, it's just backwards, so just think of it that way. And some redox reactions don't actually transfer electrons, but they change the way that the electrons are shared in the covalent bonds. So we'll see some examples of that. One example is the reaction between methane and O2. So here's methane. And methane is CH4, one carbon with 4 hydrogens, with 4 covalent bonds between the carbon and the hydrogens. And O2 is oxygen with a double bond between the two. So methane gets oxidized, oxygen gets reduced. So methane is the reducing agent, oxygen is the oxidizing agent. So what happens is basically the bonds just get rearranged. So carbon, instead of being attached to 4 hydrogens, is now attached to 2 oxygens with 2 double bonds, and this other oxygen is gets attached to 2 hydrogens. So the water becomes reduced, or the oxygen becomes reduced, and the methane becomes oxidized. Okay, so we're just rearranging chemical bonds. So it's not actually, we're not like actually transferring electrons, we're just rearranging chemical bonds. Yep. Okay. So during cellular respiration, we're going to oxidize fuel, and the water is going to get reduced. Or the H2O becomes reduced. So when the H2O gets reduced, it becomes water. So that's where the water comes from. Carbon dioxide, or glucose, becomes oxidized, so glucose becomes oxidized and becomes carbon dioxide. So since glucose is getting oxidized, it is the reducing agent. Since oxygen gets reduced, it is the oxidizing agent. So during cellular respiration, basically we don't just have glucose to carbon dioxide. There's a bunch of enzymes along the way that do a bunch of different things, just like we talked about. It's a metabolic pathway. It's a catabolic metabolic pathway. It's breaking things down. So we need a bunch of different enzymes. So you guys will see. So we get to glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, so many enzymes. But basically, the electrons are transferred from the organic compounds, so they get oxidized. They're giving up their electrons, and they get transferred to another molecule called NAD+, which is a coenzyme. But basically, the NAD+ just accepts the electrons, and it's going to be an electron carrier. It's going to take them someplace else. So since the NAD+ gains an electron, it becomes NADH. It's no longer positive. It got reduced. So that NAD+ gets reduced while the organic compound gets oxidized. So NAD+, since it gets reduced, is the oxidizing agent. And each NADH, so that's the reduced form of NAD+, is storing energy. So those electrons are being stored to make ATP, and we'll see that. So this is NADH. That's what the molecule looks like, and it gets reduced, and it gets an electron, and it picks up an H. That's where the H comes from, to balance out the electron that they got. And so, like I said, NADH carries these electrons elsewhere. So it takes the electrons out of the organic compounds and it carries them to the electron transport chain. So basically what the electron transport chain does, and we'll get there, it's a whole section on its own, is it just takes the electrons and passes them down. The electrons are at a really high energy level when they first get them, so there's a lot of energy stored in glucose, and they're just going to pass the electrons down the electron transport chain. A bunch of different enzymes pass them down and reduce their energy level slightly at each step, and so we kind of build up the energy that we're getting out of them. And then the electrons are moving towards the oxygen, because the oxygen is really electronegative. It pulls the electrons towards it. And this energy that we get from those electrons as they go down their energy levels and release energy makes ATP. Again, we'll talk about this whole thing in another section. Okay, so this is what you're going to learn. This is the overview of cellular respiration. So there's 3 steps. There's glycolysis. This is aerobic respiration. So this is happening in the presence of oxygen. So we start off with glucose. And remember, in the end, we're going to have 6 carbon dioxides instead of 6 carbons in a glucose. We're going to break all those bonds, increase the entropy of the universe, get 6 molecules instead of 1. So the first one is glycolysis. Glycolysis takes glucose, breaks it in half to 2 molecules of what we call pyruvate. Glucose has 6 carbons, pyruvate has 3, so we just split it in half. We still have all 6 carbons accounted for. Then the pyruvate goes into the citric acid cycle, and we completely break down the rest of the glucose. We break down those 2 pyruvates. And they leave the citric acid cycle as carbon dioxide, and then you breathe them out. So they're done. The carbons are done after the citric acid cycle. Glucose is entirely broken down. But then all the energy that we got out of glucose from glycolysis and the citric acid cycle hasn't been turned into ATP yet. Instead, all of that energy is going to be carried to the electron transport chain via that molecule we talked about, NADH, and a process called oxidative phosphorylation makes the ATP. So that's a whole, again, we'll talk about all of this. So they are color-coded throughout the entire chapter. So that teal color is glycolysis. That's section 9.2. The salmon color is the citric acid cycle and pyruvate oxidation. That one kind of has 2 steps. And then the purple color is the oxidative phosphorylation, which is electron transport and chemiosmosis. A bunch of big words that you will know all about. You should also be very familiar with this image, as it will appear over and over again. So we basically start with glucose, goes through glycolysis, we get pyruvate. Then pyruvate has to go through a simple step called pyruvate oxidation to go to the citric acid cycle. We make a little ATP in glycolysis. We make a little ATP in the citric acid cycle by something called substrate level phosphorylation, which is different than oxidative phosphorylation. So this only makes a little bit. Then we made NADH, those electron carriers during glycolysis. We made more of them during the citric acid cycle, and they all go to the electron transport chain and are made into tons of ATP via oxidative phosphorylation. So if you guys can see, the main organelle for this process is the mitochondria. Remember, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. What that means is that it makes all the energy for us. And so this is where cellular respiration is happening, is inside of the mitochondria, although glycolysis does happen in the cytosol. Talk about that later. So like I said, oxidative phosphorylation makes most of the ATP, and we're going to talk a ton about oxidative phosphorylation, but it is powered by redox reactions, so that's why it's called oxidative. Basically, we're making ATP. We are phosphorylating, adding a phosphate to ADP to make ATP. Okay, remember ADP and ATP go back and forth. ATP is the one that has the energy because it has that extra phosphate to give up. ADP is low energy. So when we phosphorylate ADP, we get ATP, and then we have energy. So oxidative phosphorylation is phosphorylating the ADP to make ATP by using redox reactions. And that makes 90% of the ATP during cellular respiration. But we do make some via something called substrate level phosphorylation. And we make this during glycolysis in the citric acid cycle. And basically what that is, here's a picture. Basically there's an enzyme. Remember what a substrate is. Basically there's an enzyme, takes a substrate that has a phosphate on it, adds it to ADP, then we get a product in ATP. So this is really slow because it's one enzyme at a time doing all of this. You'll see that oxidative phosphorylation can make a lot more ATP more quickly than this, but this is substrate level phosphorylation. It's substrate level because ATP or ADP is a substrate in this case. So one enzyme makes one ATP. Then the enzyme finds another ADP, makes it into an ATP. That's substrate level phosphorylation. And for each molecule of glucose that we degrade into carbon dioxide and water, we can make up to 32 molecules of ATP. And that is section 9.1.